is about a 15-minute paper, so nice and short. Although I might throw in one or two comments about this morning, which I found a very interesting discussion this morning, raised a number of very interesting points. The paper I'm going to give now is really directly segues from Craig's paper, actually, and there are lots of themes in Craig's paper that you will find echoes of in what I'm going to talk about. And I think I'll begin with the proposition that Craig hesitantly proposed, very cautiously proposed, that capitalism is not hierarchical. And I'm about to proceed to argue, in fact, more or less that point. As if I can read my phone with my ageing eyes, you know. Technology for 16-year-olds, right? Most social systems are centric in nature, but modern capitalism is curiously decentered. It is vast in scope, an amalgam of markets, industries and cities. These have widespread networks, yet none of these networks have an obvious centre. Capitalism is an intelligent social system in that it exhibits order and coherence, yet it has no directing intelligence. There is no operator at the centre of it directing it in intentional ways. It has no deliberative core, yet it facilitates specific purposes like no other social system ever has. It successfully carries out and coordinates billions of transactions every day. It does this swiftly and efficiently. Individuals and entities behave purposefully, but there is no one planning or directing their interactions. The system at the microscopic level is individualised, personalised, intentional, goal-directed and capable to a degree of being scheduled and organised. However, at the macroscopic level, the converse applies. The system at that level is anonymous. Its outcomes often are not intended or directed. Rather than system goals, at the macroscopic level, we can talk about system patterns. The antinomies of modern capitalism have caused intellectuals a nightmare for 2 centuries. Capitalism's incongruities drive them crazy. Take the case of Marx. He pointed out, reasonably enough, that capitalism was self-organising. It operated on the principle of leave it alone, laissez-faire. A series of 17th and 18th century thinkers, intellectual pioneers in effect, culminating in Adam Smith, approved of this. They thought that leaving things be led to beneficial, if uncontrolled, outcomes. They were sceptical of the state or other kinds of directing intelligence intervening in the operations of markets, industries or cities. The state's proper role was to provide law, order and some infrastructure, but not to control production and exchange. When it attempted the latter, as in the case, for example, of economic protectionism, the results in the end were counterproductive. That view, though, supposed that what was not deliberately controlled could be a force for good. In the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of intellectuals declared themselves against self-organising social systems and in favour of deliberately planned ones, where a directing intelligence, usually the state, intervened in the spontaneous sorting processes of markets, industries and cities and attempted to direct or engineer outcomes. The big shift in the intellectual view of intentional planning versus unintentional patterning occurred in the 1930s and 1940s. The immediate trigger was the Great Depression. The longer-term influence was a mix of socialism, communism, populism and progressivism, all rooted in Romanticism. A mix that concluded, in one way or other, that modern societies could control themselves by means of regulation, nationalisation, corporatisation, taxation and so on. The bad days of a laissez-faire, self-organising social system, it supposed, were over. Control was paramount. Marxism, Keynesianism, social liberalism, social democracy, totalitarianism, all concurred in that general proposition, but all disagreed how it could be applied. The American philosopher James Burnham in 1941, observing the confluence of these movements around him, concluded that a new society was being formed, one that would replace capitalism. This was the managerial society. In the 1940s, there is a sudden surge in critiques of managerialism and bureaucratic society. In the following decades, a series of thinkers on both the political left and right discussed the increasing bureaucratisation of contemporary societies and the allied phenomena of an increasingly influential elite of managers and intellectuals. And by the way, I was going to add a comment here, thinking about the conversation this morning, is a lot of those critiques came ultimately, the root source of them was actually Trotsky's critique of the revolution betrayed and the bureaucratisation of the Russian Revolution. And what you find over the course of the next 60 years that followed that critique in the 1930s is a development of what I would call two streams of Trotskyism, one a left-wing stream and then later on increasingly a right-wing kind of Trotskyism that's had, I think, quite an exceptional influence, though I think largely unremarked upon influence on the political theory and to an extent the political practice of the second half of the 20th century. And a final comment before I go back to my notes here is that I think the important thing about that Trotskyist critique, left or right, of bureaucracy is it provided an option to that other important influence in the early Castoriadis, which was that of Weber. Because what Weber said was that bureaucracy was an iron cage which was inescapable. And I think the interesting thing about Trotskyist, post-Trotskyist, left-wing and right-wing critiques of bureaucracy in the second half of the 20th century is that for all their respect of Weber, they ultimately rejected the notion that bureaucracy, or in Craig's terms, hierarchy, was actually, or bureaucratic hierarchy was an iron cage. All right, now return to the paper. The big shift in the intellectual view of intentional. No, sorry, I already read that. Now, fast forward 20 years after Burnham. Fast forward 20 years after Burnham published his book, The Managerial Revolution. In 1960, in a long essay, Modern Capitalism and Revolution, Castoriadis identified something he called bureaucratic capitalism. From this vantage point, Castoriadis mocked the Marxists. They had failed, he argued, to grasp the evolution of capitalism from a laissez-faire to a controlled system. When Marx analysed capitalism, he analysed one early form of it, not capitalism as such. From the vantage point of 1960, Marx's analysis was outdated. Capitalism had evolved into bureaucratic capitalism. Its imaginary signification, the expansion of productive forces, remained the same, yet its structural form had changed. It had become organised capitalism. In other words, capitalism could be defined as a form of society and history, part of a larger, anonymous socio-historical process. This proposition is partly true. Modern classical capitalism does appear in time, and it evolves bit by bit over time under the auspices of the imaginary signification of productivity. That seems to me to be more than plausible. However, society not only exists in history, it also exists in space. That is, like the Scottish Enlightenment did, we can assume temporal stages of social development from slave to feudal to capitalist economies. But these also exist spatially, in tandem with each other. They are coextensive as well as sequential. History, the socio-historical, implies sequence and succession. That's fine as far as it goes, but complementarity also plays an important role. Look at the synchronicity of the American slave economy and capitalist economy in the 19th century and what happened to them. Or the parallel synchronous nature of the feudal countryside and the mercantile late medieval and Renaissance city-states. Or the Hanseatic City Trading League and the feudal economies that coexisted with it. My point is that coexistence is just as important as sequence to explain the last century. Consequently, I don't think that bureaucratic capitalism is simply a stage of modern capitalism, nor do I think that the managerial society replaced capitalism. Rather, I think that modern capitalism and the managerial society coexist with each other. At points they overlap and interpenetrate, at other points they stand in opposition to each other. That is to say, in varying degrees and in different ways today, we mentally and materially inhabit two competing worlds. Has classic capitalism gone away? No. Look at economic history over the past 2 centuries. It has not changed in its basic rhythms. It rises and falls, rises and falls, and rises again. It is cyclical. Right now, in 2018, globally, we are exiting a cyclical downturn phase and entering a mild upturn. This pattern has repeated itself numerous times over the past 2 centuries. Has it changed? Very little. All the government intervention in the world has had only minimal effects on this cycle. At most, it mildly tempers the up or down movements, but it also extends them such that an overall net beneficial effect from this is not particularly apparent. Nonetheless, the managerial society has grown dramatically in the last century, fourfold if we measure it by the government share of GDP alone. Why? Because at least 1/3 of the population of any modern society, and sometimes more, dislike classic capitalism. Among the intellectuals, that figure rises to 95%. And yet, despite all of the controls of the managerial society, classic capitalism has maintained its fundamental up cycles of investment, technology, automation, inventory, consumer taste, and so on. These have proved to be pretty much inexorable. Why can't managerial society extinguish these? After all, managerialism has an incredibly high opinion of itself. So, why doesn't it act to end classic capitalism? Why doesn't it organise it out of existence? It might like to, but it can't, because classic capitalism pays its bills. The latter produces, as its imaginary significations demand, wealth, income, assets, growth, and high levels of productivity. This allows the state to extract the tax that funds big managerial institutions such as universities, schools and hospitals. It also permits large managerial firms, likewise a symptom of the managerial society, to fund layers of officers, that is, the 80% of those organisations that typically produce 20% of their revenue. In short, we live in a twin world of capitalism and managerialism. This is a bifocal, antithetical society that is, yet, to an extent, also codependent. Capitalism and managerialism are both, in some ways, historically unprecedented. Capitalism pursues the imaginary signification of developing productivity. Managerialism pursues the imaginary signification of procedural rationality. The latter emphasises impersonal rules, impersonal hierarchies, legal rational behaviour, assiduous documentation and formal processes. Modern classic capitalism entails high levels of paradox and antinomy, a trait typical of a series of societies extending back through the Renaissance and the medieval city to ancient Roman Greece. I might add all of the societies that Castoriadis himself found fascinating. Meanwhile, managerialism resurrects and reconstructs in legal rational form pre-modern phenomena of status hierarchy, allocation, distribution, grants and monopolies. Crucially, one does not just follow the other. Capitalism and managerialism are not simply sequential. They are also coexistent. They exist synchronously. They are concomitants. They form a social double, an antithetical yet overlapping, intertwining pair. This pairing produces deep tensions, uneasy conciliations, ambiguous meanings, clashing purposes, perplexing connotations, social stresses, and structural antagonisms. Contemporary denizens, to one degree or another, find themselves smack in the middle of that social double. They have to decode its conflicting subtexts and deal with its agonistic undertones and implications. They are torn between its polarities. This torn social system sometimes explicitly counterposes its antipodes. Other times it engineers odd, ramshackle, inelegant pastiches of them. One of these is bureaucratic capitalism. These pastiches, though, create their own internal tensions, stresses and strains. As we prepare to enter the third decade of the 21st century, almost 60 years after Castoriadis' 1960 essay, what confronts us today is not capitalism and revolution, nor is it simply bureaucratic capitalism, though we do have some of that. Rather, it's a bivalent and ambivalent, binary and torn pairing of capitalism and managerialism, split between the social ontologies of both, coupled in tension and locked in an uneasy union. Thank you.